Yesterday, we talked about, at the beginning, about Gibbon and the way he shaped, obviously, the idea of antiquity and the way the Roman Empire declined, and what role Christianity played in this. And today, I would like to, and yesterday, we tried to explore the social world in which a new religion like Christianity, which we have seen in the first lecture, was so different and so contrary to any common sense of the ancient world, might have had success in this social context. Today, it's more about the religious context, and Gibbon actually talked about this, and I think in a more nuanced way than maybe yesterday could have seemed, because he does not, as many others at the time, see paganism, say the ancient religions of Greece and Rome, as flourishing throughout antiquity and then being only destroyed, the destruction of paganism, by Christian emperors who impose Christianity for the whole population of the Roman Empire. But he admits, in a way, that there have been signs of crisis earlier. And he says at a certain point, which is interesting because he links it to mobility and slave trade and various social phenomena. And he says clearly from the period of the Roman emperors onward, there was a decline in these rituals and beliefs. And so it has been, it's very debated. You can read totally diverging views on the decline of paganism as related to the rise of Christianity. Clearly, the two have something to do with each other, but there are some who see paganism still flourishing in the 6th century AD, and certainly there are examples of that, and others who say when Homer writes his poems about the Greek myth and deities, it's all over already. And one of these was an extraordinary scholar and woman, Jane Harrison, who was here in Cambridge, and Mary Beard wrote a book about her. And there would be so much to say about this woman who was born in 1850 and died, I believe, in 1925 or so. And she lectured and gave talks and wrote many books and had a great vision of ancient history as something very broad. And she was somehow neglected and forgotten. Fortunately, this has begun to change, thanks also to the work that has been done here. And in one of her books, 1912, about Greek religion, this is, by the way, a portrait from 1909 by August John. It shows her clearly as an already established scholar. She talks about the Greek gods, and she says, the gods of the Greeks from Homer onward are, I quote, non-religious, because really the products of art and literature, though posing as divinities. End of quote. She's part of what has been labeled the Cambridge ritualists or anthropologists, as she herself labeled her work. So the idea is that the real religion of the ancient peoples of the Mediterranean is not in the statues that were found in Pompeii. It's not in the temples. It's not in the poems and prayers and mythological epic poems, but it's in the ritual. And these rituals are deeply rooted in the agricultural and rural life of the Mycenaean and early Iron Age period. And the question is, where in this long and controversial history can we place Pompeii? Does it tell us anything about this crisis of ancient paganism? And if so, does it point to one direction or the other? There are two great urban sanctuaries in Pompeii, the Temple of Athena, Minerva in Latin, which is near the theatre, and the Temple of Apollo. There are others, of course, the Temple of Venus, which is very late. Recent excavation has shown it's even later than we used to think, probably early imperial. The Temple of Theseus I will talk about at the end. But the two sanctuaries of Athena and Apollo, Greek divinities, at least from the name, then were somehow assimilated to local deities, are certainly the main sanctuaries of the city. There were sanctuaries in the countryside also, but I today would like to focus on these because they really express the spirit of these kind of rituals and fasts. The Athena sanctuary, however, there's a discussion, but it seems that the temple was in ruin at the moment of the eruption. There were still rituals going on, probably, but this is really difficult to tell. In the ancient ritual practices, there's a great shift, which I think has received too little attention from archaeologists working in the field, which can be roughly described as a change in the late Republican, so in the last centuries BC. There's a change in how people leave evidence of the rituals in the sanctuaries. They used to leave objects there, thousands of objects, could be statues, buildings, but most of all, pots, remains of sacrifices, miniature vases, small figurines, all that was left in the sanctuary as a trace, as a memory of the people who had been there, and often of ritual banquets. For example, you would leave some of the cups and plates that were used. And then this stops, and people start to write and use inscriptions and writing to somehow replace this type of memory. The Temple of Apollo is close to the Forum, very central. We know that at least in the time of the Emperor Augustus, there were still rituals and processions and choirs and sacrifices. This is a reconstruction of the sanctuary as it was imagined in the early 19th century. But it certainly gives an idea, not in the all details, but in the importance and the really architecturally art, colors. These were really also costly and expensive places. I came across Jane Harrison when working on this book, so I have to warn you, I will take you now through a very broad, long historical chronological journey. I try to do it very rapidly to understand what these buildings, because it all comes from there, what we have seen. So not only the Greek names, the architecture is also clearly inspired and depends actually on the Greek model. And I think a major shift, a first major shift in these ancient rituals and cults were linked to agriculture and fertility of the fields and the agricultural years and different moments in the year. All this was further dramatically shaken in the 6th century BC, which is also the time when this type of architecture, which we see then in Pompeii, still is first developed and created. And this was the thesis of the book, which is in contrast with the traditional view, the idea that this type of architecture and all what is linked to it were the result of a slow and organic and somehow natural development, evolution. And the idea of evolution, that it almost comes naturally and you arrive from so-called primitive wooden huts and buildings automatically without any artistic intention, but it happens at the Doric temple. This is Marc-Antoine Rougier. Winkelmann played a role in this too. His journey to Paestum, Thomas Major, the Temple of Paestum, and it depends. This is John Soane. In London, the John Soane House has this marvelous drawings and things he brought from all over the Mediterranean. And you can see that the primitive hut, which is the title, with very early humans in animal skins, somehow anticipates the Temple of Neptune in Paestum. And so there's a direct line. This is William Chambers. So here you can see it very systematically from the earliest forms of human architecture. There's a straight line to the Doric temple and then also to the Corinthian capitals and so forth. This evidently has roots also in ancient theory, and it has been very surprisingly resistant. This is Dinsmore, 1950, and there's still people who promote these views, although not in the way we have seen, but somehow the ideas, that the structure, the Doric frieze and the column, it all comes from structural factors. So you needed the triglyphs to cover the roof beams and the metopes to close the space in between and so forth. All this has been questioned recently, especially, and colleagues have tried to argue, I think convincingly, that nothing of this can be demonstrated in the evidence, that the Doric temple is really not an evolution, but some kind of revolution. Invention, certainly. It requires much creativity. It receives important influences and inspiration from other cultures, especially from Egypt, which was something Winkelmann could, of course, not admit, because an African culture in his mind could not be the source of the Greek genius. So he had this ideological problem. He clearly he saw that there were similarities, and he then makes an enormous effort to explain why it's only seemingly the case. This is the mortar temple of Hatshepsut in Thebes west. And so the idea was to, starting from Paestum, where we had done some new research that, especially on the metopes from the extra-urban sanctuary. So this is the city of Paestum, Posidonia, founded by Greek settlers in 600 BC, and there's a sanctuary on the border towards the neighboring territory on the river Sele, and there are some of the earliest, Greek Doric reliefs and metopes, and actually a frieze with almost 40 of these were found, which are now in the Archaeological Museum in Paestum. And new research, partly excavations under the newer temple and the multispectral analysis of some of these metopes who were often thought not to be finished. You can see they are only contour, but actually they were painted. So this is not so important here, just to show you that this allowed us to advance a new reconstruction of this very early monumental Greek temple at Focecele. And it's evident that the frieze and other elements of the Doric architecture had absolutely no structural function whatsoever. So it's clearly something merely aesthetic. They wanted to have, you can here see the structure of the roof as reconstructed, and the frieze is actually just put in front of it. So it's it has the function to bear images, which is something new, and it's also the case in other places like Locri. These are, of course, all reconstructions which could be debated and questioned case after case. But also the idea here, this is Delphi, the Monopteros of the Sicyonians, and you see that this has no structural function, but by sculpturing the boat, the ship, over two metopes and pretending that it had to be interrupted by a triglyph, by this element here, they somehow behaved as if it was necessary to have all these elements, although it clearly wasn't from an architectural, structural viewpoint. The whole development in this period is really marvelously, can be summarized by what happens in another early sanctuary, the sanctuary of Aphaia, a Greek goddess on an island of Aegina near Athens, where originally this was just an open-air grove, right? A place from the Bronze Age, from the second millennium BC. There was some kind of sacred area. You didn't know exactly where it began. The goddess later, much later, Pausanias, the Greek writer, recounts that she would show herself between the trees. So you didn't know if you went there whether you would meet her or not. And it had also something terrifying, right? It was something a bit ambiguous. And then around 600, it completely changes, this sanctuary. And this is so emblematic for the whole process in Greece, and we'll see also in other parts in Italy of this period. There's a priest, Theoitas, And he has built a house, oikos, for the goddess, so the first temple. He makes an altar and a phrynkos, which is some kind of fence or wall around the sanctuary. So now the sacred is divided from the profane land, and an image of ivory of the goddess. So she is placed inside the temple. This is the reconstruction of this earliest temple by Schwantner. So you can imagine he forgot the trees. So you have to imagine a woodland here, woody hills, and now you have. And he also forgot the fence, by the way. But you have now this place controlled by male elite members, like Theotis. And inside you can see the goddess. If he lets you in the temenos, the fenced area, and inside the temple. So it's now not the goddess who shows herself spontaneously, but it's the male elite members who control access, and then on certain occasions they would open the doors and have processions and bring the image out of the temple. So this is, I think, what Jane Harrison meant when she said it's not religious anymore. Now it's only art and literature, which means it's also controlled by those who produce art and literature or who commission it. This is the plan of the sanctuary. You see also the wall area and the propylon. So you have these gates and access barriers. Another example of what's happening in this period is Dodona, the sanctuary of Zeus. Often Zeus didn't have temples. It was the most important god in a way, we think so, but in practice, in ritual practice, he had this central role. And many sanctuaries are open-air sanctuaries. And this typically, it was just a tree. You have this valley in northern Greece, where an old oak, which then survived, apparently, the entire ancient period and was eventually cut down as the tree on the Hadrian's Wall, sadly, in the UK, by Christians who came with axes and decided to cut down the oak. I think in the 4th century AD. And so this is an attempt. First, you have the oak and some tree pots around it. This comes later, this small building. And then over time, it changes. And at the end, it's all about architecture. And you can't get to the tree anymore, but you can recognize it. You know, this must be the holy tree. It's almost some kind of landscape architecture, right? And so this is a process, and I think maybe more than these wonderful drawings, this is what you have to imagine as, you know, this is something completely different. This is Caspar David Friedrich's Einsamer Baum, Lonely Tree. But imagine you go there into some valley in northern Greek, in a culture where scripture wasn't yet so common, and you see a tree. How do you know that it's sacred? Why is it sacred? Why this one? Why not this one? And so all this means that the sacred land, or the sacred elements, the divinities who inhabit the landscape, are there on their own account, and humans have just to recognize the presence of the divinities in the land. And then you need people who tell you this is the sacred tree. So it's based on oral culture and oral and face-to-face society. So all this changes radically with the Doric temple, because for the first time there's a building type which is clearly recognizable as a sacred building. This is a reconstruction of the earlier temple. There were not only holy trees and mountains and rivers, and basically the whole landscape was inhabited by divinities. There's a wonderful book by Susan Goodall-Cole, Landscapes, Gender and Ritual Space, the Ancient Greek Experience, where she describes how these different entities live together. So you had a landscape and humans were doing their stuff, agriculture and pasture and settlement, but you always had to be cautious not to disturb the other entities who live in the same landscape everywhere, right? The sources, the nymphs who lived in trees and fountains and so on. And so there were also temples in the settlements, but as this reconstruction from Eretria, the Greek settlement on the island of Evia shows, they were like bikras. So even then, you couldn't really tell if you came to a settlement. Right? There were different huts or houses, and one was maybe a sacred building, but it wasn't immediately visible. This here, Corfu, Greek settlement in Western Greece, you could, around early 6th century, one of the earliest Greek Doric temples, you immediately see this must be a temple. You can come from any place in the Greek world, and it's clear. And if you sailed along the coast of Sicily, and you looked as the French drawer Hulot had imagined, you looked toward the land and saw the Greek colony of Selinus, you could see the temples and their signs, and they were something totally different from the houses where the people lived, right? So in the book I try to find explanations for this sort of revolution, and I try to explore two levels, two dimensions. One is the regional and supra-regional, the idea of networks, to, as I said, be able to recognize. So people coming to other places, and you don't need someone to tell you when you come to Olympia or to Delphi, see here the sanctuary of Delphi, to these so-called pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, but also to cities. You don't need anyone to tell you this is our holy place and the holy tree. You can just immediately see it. So there's some form of standardization, and we all Greeks, we can all recognize ourselves in this identity, in this culture. But at the same time, it's also, every form of standardization opens to competition. And every kind of competition needs standardization. So this is the time when, of the great pan-Hellenic games and contests, Delphi, Nemea, and so forth. So people coming there, elite members, obviously, named elite members coming there to these places, and doing musical and sports, of course, athletic games, and measuring themselves against others. It's the time when monumental sculpture has a return in Greece after centuries of absence, after the Mycenaean period. And so you can see these two, the so-called kuroi, are highly standardized, which means it's often seen as some kind of a lack, of development and these archaic, primitive, maybe, but it's quite the contrary. Because to obtain this level of standardization in all over Greece, right, in a society where there were hundreds of city-states and they often fought with each other, and there was no national broadcast or anything that could, or even a king, you know, who could say, we all now make statues like this. It was something that came from the local elites. And it had the function that if all Kuroi look the same, it's all about size, right? Who builds the biggest? And there's some which are really colossal. I think you can see some of these as cards in the museum here. The same holds true for temples. They all look the same. So the bigger, the better. And then eventually someone has the idea of making an inscription. I put this up. So it's clearly linked to these forms of elite competition. Then this is one level. There's also another one, which is local. In this period, the land becomes a contested, somehow needed resource. Up to then, it was more manpower. Like the Spartans conquered the Messenians not so much to have more land, because they wouldn't have the manpower to work it, to cultivate it. So they needed the people. And so they enslaved them, and they became slaves of the Spartan community. And this changes around 600. Now, as the French historian Julien Zurbac has formulated, the land is filled. And so one polis territory borders directly with the other. People need more land. The elites want to enfranchise the population so they can become part of the army and so forth. So obviously, this means colonization. People are being sent away to other places of the Mediterranean, but there's also something like internal colonization. And this means a new idea of the city that are used all around 600. Then these new cities with a rectangular plan and a very rational idea of how the city is organized. And the temples have to fit into this. Right? It's not anymore that you have to find the sacred, the holy presence in the landscape by some spiritual technique, but you decide, as Ira Malkin has said, it's the temples and the sanctuaries follow the same rational principles as the layout of the whole city. And the same holds true for the countryside. This is Metapontum. You can see this where they have found traces of a division of the land in blocks, and these were canals and drains. And it's almost like it's the projection of the city into the landscape. And so it's all part of a great network. There are other examples. We talked about it yesterday with Jane about this is Chersonesos on the Black Sea. And what you see here, this pattern on a large area, is from a satellite photograph. And it's from the Greek period, the Greek colonization. So they structured the landscape in such a manner that in some cases, until today, you can see it from outer space. The same, roughly, I was trying to be very synthetic, is happening in Italy. In Italy, the Greeks are, in this period, the model, culturally and architecture, art, and so forth. This is William Turner, the Golden Ball, the idea of Fraser, who reconstruct from who was part of this movement, like Jacob Harris, the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Also in contemporary society, many things were changing. There was a desire for the irrational, and people were somehow disappointed with enlightenment and pure rationality. And so many movements, also in contemporary art and spirituality, and you know, start the new things. And so these ancient evidence sources about the lupus, which is the opening in the woods of Nemi, an ancient sanctuary, and you didn't really know, and the priest was the king, ritual king, who then had to be killed by the next one, and so very archaic and somehow unclassical rites, and no temple, no altars. It's just a place in the woods, as Turner has tried to imagine. And because of the Greek influence and urbanization and land measurement, then this develops in the same direction as we've seen in Greece. And this is the lucus, so the opening in Nemo. So lucus in the opening in the forest. This is what it becomes then in the late Republican period. This is Gavi, a site outside Rome, but there are many other examples. They found these holes on the terrace, in the pavement, in regular distances. And Hans Lauter argued convincingly that this was to plant trees. And so, as you can see, this is the holy grove in this stage of development. It has become part of architecture. It's not surrounding the holy space anymore, it's part of it. And it's almost as a representation of it's not a real forest, right? And it's also organized according to the same rational pattern as the city and the architecture, the columns and the porticos and so forth. And I think we can say that the Romans went even beyond what the Greeks did in the way they structured and parceled and rationalized the landscape in Pompeii and in Italy and in all over the Roman Empire. Around Pompeii, there are many villas, and we discussed about this these days. What does it mean for the economy and agricultural hinterland of Pompeii? How many people lived there? Difficult questions, I think. But this is the villa of the Pisanella, it's called. And you can see there's some are a bit smaller, many have this size. And you can see that it's a huge complex. So it required slave labor. It's specialized on wine production. Wine is then exported to other parts of the Mediterranean. There were other products too, but it's something in between a farmstead and some kind of, enterprise. And as I said, it needed investment. It needed someone behind this who brought the slaves and invested in the buildings and tools and land, and I think we have to imagine the countryside around Pompeii is not so well known because it's hidden under the same layers of lapilli and ash like the ancient city, but basically we have to imagine a densely occupied landscape around Pompeii with these kinds of agricultural farms. And what this means inside the city, I would like to take you now yet another time on one of the excavation sites, which we have looked at yesterday, number 3, the insular house block number 10 in the central region, quarter of Pompeii. And yesterday we talked about this house here with the bakery. Today I would like to talk about this here, which is only partly, we're beginning to see it. It's a large house, one of the big houses of Pompeii, had a great peristyle here, which begins to emerge, and a bath complex, private bath complex here. Here, recently we found a large dining room, which had these black walls and mythological paintings of the Trojan War. So Ares and Helena, Apollo and maybe Cassandra. Really one of the big houses of Pompeii. And outside this large dining room, there's a great window, which is typical. Which is not so typical is what you could see was a small piece of garden, not a great peristyle. And then you had here this kind of backyard with a stair, which you have seen in one of the images before. And on the other side, a small room, which you see here, which we interpret as a sacrarium. So this would be not the house altar, the lararium, which we've seen yesterday, but a place where you could keep sacred objects, and so some kind of chapel inside the private residence. And you can see here that it has some kind of 4-room as in chamber, and then a blue, painted in blue, this room with niches on the wall. And at the time of the eruption, it was used as a storage room. So there was maybe restoration work going on, amphoras, shells, and various materials. The decoration, the statues aren't there anymore. So they're probably, these niches were meant to house small statues. But the decoration on the wall is interesting, I think. There are 2 figures coming in, you see these 2. We think this is maybe the only representation of a plot from ancient Pompeii. So this is probably the allegory of agriculture. Whereas she here holds a pedum, which is the staff of the shepherds. So this would be animal husbandry, pasture farm. And on the other walls, the 2, there are 4 figures, which are the four seasons of the year: spring, summer here, autumn, and winter. So it has a clearly agricultural imagery. This is not always the case, but often you get this type of references. There aren't even so many sacraria, chapels of this type in Pompeii. There are some examples. This is the house of de la Regina Carolina. You see there's such a niche too, and then images Dionysus and the goats and landscapes. Others are, we saw this in the first lecture. This is the house of the Principe di Napoli, the Prince of Naples. not commonly not interpreted as a sacrarium, but I think it's quite clear. Also because these are very low, really strongly, and it's in close to the garden in the portico. And the central figure here is Dionysus, who has also this role of protecting vegetation and vineyards, of course. And then you see Aphrodite and other divinities on the walls. Often there are landscapes. This is the newly excavated sacrarium. This is the one in the house of the Prince of Naples, which were probably made by the same workshop. And you see these imaginary landscapes, which are very common in Pompeii, with architecture, mountains, water, and then these ancient elements of religious sites, columns, small rocks with sometimes statues of deities like Priapos. So the rural, old countryside, ancient religion was there still celebrated in these paintings. But of course, this had no relation to reality, because all this was happening at the same time when the countryside was densely occupied by these specialized great villas for wine production to export wine and work mainly by slaves. So it's really something detached from the social reality of the time. And I think it shows how people were dealing with this feeling of loss and of being in a society of high mobility and social stratification, and where city and countryside didn't belong really together anymore as in the ancient times, and these people had no direct experience of what they were seeing on the walls. And I think this actually contributed to the idea that, this was all more or less a game. It's like pretending something. Maybe it's not a coincidence that the sacrarium was at some point simply used as a storage room. This means it wasn't so important that it was a holy place and that you did certain rituals there. It was more like a decoration, some kind of theater, some kind of pretending that this was there and playing as if. There were still, I think, elements of the ancient Roman religion that were living and flourishing. We yesterday saw the house on town with the sacrifice still in place, and this kind of house rituals and cults were really very important to pay, present in all the important houses, the house of Betty, the house of Menander, with these altars. And I think this can also be explained by the social role of these rituals inside the family. Yesterday we saw it's the paterfamilia who has to perform these sacrifices on behalf of the whole family. And I think it's somehow comparable to today, people who might not go to church often, then still go to the first communion or confirmation or whatever, do certain rituals, birthday parties or Christmas, you don't go to church all year, but then Christmas maybe yes. And this type of, because it has a social role, it's not so important. Spiritual content, because I don't know, the family meets, or you can show off your cooking capacities or whatever. And then there's another type of rituals and religious practices that are still important, I think, which are linked to divinities like Isis. Isis had also a sanctuary in Pompeii, close to the theater. It actually was probably linked physically to the theater. It had a very active community. They sometimes appear in inscriptions where they promote certain candidates for political offices and so forth. And they set up statues and people from different social backgrounds, also not only the elite members. And there too, this is from the Isis sanctuary, the ibis, the bird, and these landscapes, which evoke the ancient. There's often a tree, and the tree grows into the architecture, and sometimes the architecture is a bit in the state of ruins. So the idea that this is all very old, and we somehow preserve it simply because it's old and this is a value in itself. I think this is also very evident from another recent finding, which is a great puzzle. It's the ceiling of the tablinum from the house with the bakery. And I think there you can see the same detachment on the one hand, and play with these ritual elements. This is a scene from the Nile. You see the Nile with the sanctuaries, trees, rituals, musicians. Has also a sexual component here, and these are the phaloi of Dionysus with the cult, pots and cups and so forth. Often these elements are combined with theatre masks in this period, and I think this goes about the same. So you see these are all fragments from the ceiling that had collapsed, and which we are now trying to put together. And this goes, I think, in the same direction as what I said before. So it's all a theater, right? It's all a game, and what you see is not really the landscape or the divinity, which are very common in Pompeii, the gods all over the place and goddesses, but it's some kind of scenography, therefore the theatre masks. And this is Villa San Marco in Stabie, near Pompeii. In this part here, which had also all these villas, this was a huge villa, wealthiest people of the area, but it also has a production element, because it was important that these villas were also farms, active farms. And in this part here, another ceiling was found with paintings, and it shows the so-called planisphero. So it's a representation of the universe as they imagined it. They knew the world was round, that the earth was round, and they had this idea of planets going around the sun, obviously. And there too, all this is, so So they had, a lot of science. It was not perfect, but they knew a lot of things. And you see also the divinities, a small boy with grain. So summer, autumn, like the course of the year, and all this then is also framed by theatre masks. So the idea, which comes up in this time, of the Theatrum Mundi, the whole world is a theatre, a game, a play, and the gods are inside the play. They're part of this, and not outside. This would then be the Christian version of this idea. This is a reconstruction of this place. And you see this somehow philosophical, scientific image framed by theatre masks, and it was just scenography, the scenario for lavish banquets with the view on the Gulf of Naples. And I think this really brings us back to the question I raised at the beginning. And it's perfectly mirrored in the literature of the time. This is Horace, echo number 2. And it's part of this bucolic poetry, like Virgil and others also, but mainly Virgil and the bucolic, like writing about the old way of living in the countryside and where you would sacrifice and a simple life, and it's better, than living in the city. But of course, all these people lived in the city who were writing this. And this poem is really great in this, because it starts, it's much longer, with this Beatus ille qui procuribus, the happy is who lives far from the affairs and the things of the city and tills the soil like the ancient did. And then there's also a religious part, right? When autumn comes, he would, bring the sacrifices, offerings to Priapus and Silvanus, the protector of the borders. This was important for the farmers at the time. And then he would be surrounded by Vernas, the slaves born in the house. We yesterday talked about the impact of slavery on the society. And so this idea that in the ancient times, people would eat together with the slaves, and it really was a family all together. And all around the Lares, the household gods, the splendid household. So this really idyllic image, which we can see then also in the landscape, paintings and so forth. But this is all in today, printed, why not? In quote marks, because this is said by Alpheus, who lends money and he imagines that he's going to be a farmer. That's all imagination. It's imagination by a money lender who lends out the money at the Oedipus, so in mid of the month, and then asks it back with interest, of course, at the end of the month. And I think this really shows the voidness of ancient, not only bucolic images, but of the whole system of traditional religion. And this is why then something happens which is somehow maybe surprising, but maybe it's just logical. When I talk about paganism, paganism comes from Pagus, which is the village, the countryside. Jesus, of course, did not go to the cities. He went to small places in Galilee. But then Christianity really spread in the cities. And in the cities, people imagined that in the countryside, things were still like they used to be, and often maybe they really were, which is why at some point they say that I pagani, those who are in the countryside, are probably those who still cling to the ancient religion, but in the city it's only a play and a game. Thank you for your attention.